Hey everybody, welcome back. With this video, we're continuing to talk about Nietzsche. We're going to cover On Truth and Lies in a non-moral sense with this video. I'm going to try to get it all done in one video, but if we've got to do two, then we've got to do two. You'll notice all my preciouses are absent. A less interesting backdrop, I'm sure. I'm in the process of moving, so hopefully soon I'll be set up in a new place and I'll have a more interesting backdrop. Whether or not it's my books or not, who knows? Could be a window, plant, I don't know. So let's go ahead and get started. We're just going to start at the beginning of, again, On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense. It's page 114 in your reader. So let's take a minute to read some of these opening sentences. He says, "Once upon a time, in some out-of-the-way corner of that universe which is dispersed into numberless twinkling solar systems, there was a star upon which clever beasts invented knowing. That was the most arrogant and mendacious minute of world history. But, nevertheless, it was only a minute. After nature had drawn a few breaths, the star cooled and congealed, and the clever beasts had to die. One might invent such a fable, and yet he still would not have adequately illustrated how miserable, how shadowy and transient, how aimless and arbitrary the human intellect looks within nature. There were eternities during which it did not exist." So this is going to re-emphasize some of the things that we've already said and perhaps push it a little bit further. Basically, this story that humanity has of itself and its various intellectual, philosophic, scientific pursuits are for Nietzsche just that. They're just a story. That, and this is sort of like, him beginning with Once Upon a Time, sort of alerts us to this. That, whatever narrative, whatever explanation we come up with that tries to tell us where we came from, why we're here, where we're going, what it's all about, that there are even such things as like actual objects of knowledge, that there's actually truth, that there's even principles. And this is not even, saying that a scientific explanation is better than a mythological explanation. In some ways it's better, and in some ways it's deficient, and in some ways it's just the same. That the real situation is that there were oceans of time, eternities, as Nietzsche puts it, in which there were no human beings, and there was no human consciousness, and there were no products of human consciousness. That the universe just was doing whatever it is that the universe is doing, and then we showed up at some point, right? Perhaps through a very slow evolutionary process. Now, some people might not have religious views or some other view that is easily able to accept that. But I think that Nietzsche, giving a somewhat materialist view of the universe, that he's just not going to accept some sort of metaphysical explanation, whether or not one even knows that it's metaphysical. And maybe to put that another way, you can assume that you are giving a rational account of the universe. But if you are still engaging in a form of thinking that relies upon causality, or that relies upon some strict congruence or coherence between the words or the symbols or the methodological claims that you're making and an actual reality, that's still basically um, conjectural or metaphysical or lends itself to a particular type of ideology. That the truth is that human beings and their various faculties and powers of creation and powers of reason and whatever else you want to add, um, they don't really do what it is that we think. Those powers don't really do what we think that they do, and that there's really nothing sort of there in terms of abstracted ideas or principles, anything that truly explains anything. Now, that does not mean that there's not really elegant and beautiful explanations. Again, they could be mythic, they could be scientific, they could work really well, they could help solve lots of problems. But Nietzsche, in part, I think, is calling out the thing that a lot of people don't tend to notice, and that is that whatever problems we have, cosmologically speaking, in terms of creation, in terms of the nature of knowledge itself, in terms of what it is that we rely on to give us adequate explanations, that all of these problems, questions, I mean, that we invented these too. That the only reason that they're problems is because we create these problems. They don't actually exist as problems. Um, let's see. Maybe that'll become a little bit more clear as we go along. We invent these miserable creatures invent knowing. They invent world history. Um, again, we're basically just really clever creatures, and all the other creatures seem to exist without knowledge as such, as we come to think of knowledge. They seem to exist, quote unquote, fine, without being historical beings. No sense of the fact that they are, the the thousandth or the millionth, generation of a species. That they just exist now, and they live according to their instincts largely, right? But that we don't feel this way about ourselves. He says, of course, time's going to go by. The star or the planet on which we live. If it wasn't clear, the clever beast he's talking about, that's us, right? That this once upon a time story isn't him just imagining some other place, some alternate reality or whatever. He's just talking about us. And for some people, this is a lovely fairy tale. For some people, it's a nightmare. But for Nietzsche, he's using this sort of this structure, if you will, of a once upon a time like a fairy tale, to just help play up this critique that many people don't undertake. The critique of just defaulting to or embracing a position of the self-importance of the species and the assumption that the things that we think that we know are actual real things. And again, I know I already said it, but I'll say it again. It's not that the practicality or the efficacy or even the power of any of these things that we invent. I mean, like engineering seems to work really well, and we seem to have a really good understanding of the human body, and that really helps us with medicine. And go down the list of all these things that seem to work really well. It's not an absurd argument that he's trying to say that all of that stuff is all imaginary. But he is saying that this doesn't, extrapolate into an abstract reality where such a thing as truth exists, such a thing as like an objective account of reality in a sort of metaphysical sense that would then play into human beings having some sort of purpose, that people knowing the truth or becoming free or anything like that is based on anything other than part of the narrative or various narratives that we have invented to tell ourselves. So hopefully that distinction makes sense to you. But he says, we're on this planet. Eventually, this planet is going to end. It's just eventually the star, our sun, is gonna it's not gonna last forever, even if we were around that long. Perhaps it'll be a change in environmental or ecological conditions. God forbid, maybe an asteroid or a virus. Whatever it is, that we're not going to live forever. Not just as people, obviously individuals, but like as a species that will end, right? And all the things that we thought that we discovered, all the things that we thought that we invented that were so awesome, that all that's just going to fade in time too. That none of it is signifying what we think that it signifies. And so he says that really this story illustrates for us just how miserable, shadowy, transient, aimless, and arbitrary human looks within nature. And again, the last sentence that we read of that part, that basically there were just aeons of time in which there wasn't knowing, there wasn't knowledge. And so that should sober us up. That should really get us to take a look in the mirror about and I talked about this a little bit in the previous video, starting from a position of nihilism. Not nihilism as a sort of embracing of that purposelessness, meaninglessness, no truth, whatever, and that one then, adopts a sort of, let's just call it a dark philosophy of existence. And there are people that do that, and it's just what you would imagine it to be. It's very, very honest, but it's also very, very depressing, right? And Nietzsche, a lot of people think that, like, they're the sort of by reputation that Nietzsche is depressing. He's really not. But he starts from a place that requires that we be incredibly honest, right? If we start with that incredible degree of honesty, he believes that it will ignite certain people to begin to undertake certain sorts of projects. And this is an idea that, like, later existentialists are gonna pick up, that once you can no longer assume that things work a particular way and that by default your life has value or that it has meaning, and you realize that just doesn't exist unless, right, you undertake the work of beginning to justify your life, to give it some sort of purpose or meaning. And if you are creative and you're talented and you've got a profound intellect or whatever the case might be, you've got a certain allotment of gifts, again, not because of any particular thing that you did. It's just, not everybody gets to be a professional basketball player. Not everybody, gets to invent the next new big thing that changes society. But some people do. And that, for Nietzsche, for these people that can contribute to culture in a particular way, perhaps realizing that, it only happens if they do it. That what he is doing is spurring people to undertake their lives in much more, again, honest, committed, intentional ways that, like the last person we read, Emerson, has them reject a lot of the usual ideas that people have, a lot of the conformity, right? And they go another way. Um, or perhaps Nietzsche provokes people to reinvest in society, playing a particular sort of role, a functionary sort of role, in which they're just making it possible for those people to undertake, those more powerful, creative lives. So, okay, saying all that, let's look at the top of page 115. Nietzsche's going to talk a little bit about deception and about lying, right? Like, we remember the title of the work is On Truth and Lies in a Non-Moral Sense. So that is to say, how do we think about truth? How do we think about lies or deception in a way that has no morality associated with it? Like, what perhaps is really going on with it, not in the usual ways that we think about it. So, saying that, top paragraph, page 115. He says, as a means for preserving the individual, the intellect unfolds its principal powers in dissimulation, which is the means by which weaker, less robust individuals preserve themselves, since they have been denied the chance to wage the battle for existence with horns or with sharp teeth or beasts of prey. This art of dissimulation reaches its peak in man, in people, right? So, because we don't have claws and teeth and naturally thick hides or shells, we don't have horns, right? All of these sort of ways that we would naturally attack or defend ourselves. Nietzsche says we've got lying, and the way that weaker people, obviously we would, we could and should push back in terms of what that actually signifies. But to follow out his thought, the idea here is that there are powerful people in society, right? Both perhaps in the way that we were talking about it in terms of a certain allotment of, gifts, as it were, but also in a sense of political power. They're just people that, because of their station in society, their position, their economic resources, perhaps their political standing, whatever. That in that sense there are also weaker people, and that these weaker people, what they have at their disposal within these various power dynamics. And power dynamics are always at play, right? There's power dynamics at play when you go to the grocery store, and there's power dynamics in the classroom, and there's power dynamics, in churches, and there's power dynamics in interpersonal relationships. Like, it's not just strictly, like a political thing or an economic thing. It's all the time that there is always people that have the ability to sort of ultimately call the shots or set the terms for things. And Nietzsche's he's not judging it. He's not trying to say, let's get away from this. This is just like naturally arising hierarchies in other creatures, that we human beings have it too. And what are the lower folks on the totem pole have? They have the ability to deceive, right? They have the ability to lie to those in power. And if you're wondering whether or not this is true, I mean, this is happening sometimes almost just automatically. It's not like overtly lying, although that happens too. It's when you sort of color what you say to present it a particular way. And it might have some truth to it, but you're definitely playing fast and loose with the truth in order to assert what little bit of power you have. And this could be the way that you present your situation to a professor. This could be the way that you present yourself to a prospective boss, a prospective love interest, that, whatever the case might be, the situation might be, that, you try to put the best foot forward. You try to give an image of yourself or what's going on with you, or what you like, or this thing that you did, and you really don't want it to sort of be just presented in an honest and transparent way. You want to sort of put a spin on it, right? These are examples, and it also is showing up in terms of like you walk into a place of business and someone says, "How are you doing?" And you're like, "Oh, I'm doing good. How are you?" Something like that, right? Which we don't often think about that as lying, but it's certainly not an opportunity for like an introspective moment in which you really start to like share how you feel. It is a question that is asked um, with no real intention of getting an honest answer, again, for the most part. And then the person who is responding is also not really giving an honest answer. That this is part of this mask wearing that he's talking about here. That depending on the situation that we're in, we put on a different mask. Like you're talking to your friends, you have one mask on. You're talking to your family members, you put another mask. You're talking to the cops, you put on another mask. Hopefully a great one. But whatever the situation is, you comport yourself differently. You carry yourself differently. You perhaps change how you speak. And some of you are like, I don't. Well, I mean, number one, I don't know if that's entirely true. But number two, um, for better or worse, and I think probably for worse, in a practical sense. I'm not talking about like integrity of character or anything like that. Again, we're trying to think about it in a non-moral sense. Um, that there's just a practical benefit to according yourself to the situation and adopting a version of yourself that is, fit to those ends, right? And so the casual way and the honest way and the flippant way that you might have conversations with your friends is probably not how you're going to roll up on a job interview, right? Or you've got to go to court, or whatever the situation is. That you'll probably dress differently, you'll probably speak differently, you'll probably be a little bit more cautious in certain situations. And these are just sort of extreme examples, right? But on another level, it's happening to on this large sort of spectrum of possible ways that you present yourself. Basically, you're a liar, and everyone's a liar, right? And what Nietzsche's trying to say is like, let's stop being dramatic about it, or let's stop lying to ourselves about lying to ourselves, about us lying. That this is something that goes on all the time, and if we're just really honest about how we're communicating with other people in relationship to our thought life, then it's hard to deny this. He says deception, flattering, lying, deluding, talking behind the back, putting up a false front, living in borrowed splendor, wearing a mask, hiding behind conventions, playing a role for others and for oneself. In short, a continuous fluttering around the solitary flame of vanity. Right? This gets all about like ego preservation, right? Is so much the rule and the law among men that there is almost nothing which is less comprehensible than how an honest and pure drive for truth could have arisen among them. I mean, Nietzsche's saying, we do all this talk about truth, and yet no one can even be honest about how they really are. So why do we seem to be so obsessed with truth? If you drop down a few lines, he says, what does man actually know about himself? Is he indeed ever able to perceive himself completely, as if laid out in a highlighted display case? Does nature not conceal most things from him, even concerning his own body? I mean, he's saying something like, he's getting at the fact that like knowledge, truth in particular, as a product of consciousness, as perhaps the supreme way in which we talk about knowledge whatsoever. That this is a bit of an illusion, right? And what might alert us to this is that we don't even know what's going on within ourselves. what's going on with your blood right now? How's your liver doing? Right? Let's check that gallbladder. Let's like we are as beings unknown to ourselves in the most material flesh, bone, and blood way to assume that on an abstract level that we are somehow going to become aware of these otherwise secret truths because we just haven't discovered them yet or haven't come up with the proper theory or the scientists just haven't captured it yet in the laboratory or with with the telescope or we'll get there. We'll get there one day, right? That Nietzsche's like, let's just be honest. Let's be real. You don't know what's going on with yourself, um, and the idea that you could get in touch with yourself is largely impossible. And we should just use this as a sort of creaturely starting place, not to stop creating truths, because that's what Nietzsche thinks that it is, and we'll talk about that in just a second, but to think that there are truths out there to be known um, is just a continuation of this sort of self delusion about who we are, what we're about, and what we can accomplish. Yeah. Okay. So, yeah. Nietzsche says this is like the first way that he talks about truth in this piece. He says, this is the bottom paragraph. Insofar as the individual wants to maintain himself against other individuals, he will, under natural circumstances, employ the intellect mainly for dissimulation, to lie. But at the same time, from boredom and necessity, man wishes to exist socially and with the herd. Therefore, he needs to make peace and strive accordingly to banish from the world at least the most flagrant bellum omnia contra omnes, the war of all against all. So we want to principally defend ourselves against others. We want to preserve ourselves. It's just a natural instinct. But sometimes we want to chill out with everybody. We want to start societies and we want to have affiliations and we want to associate and we want to collaborate and we want to do all that kind of stuff too. And so we want to live in a convivial fashion with the herd, right? With the they, right? And so what he's going to talk about is we're basically going to invent a peace treaty, and this peace treaty is maybe the first way that we can think about truth, and that's in terms of agreed upon meanings to things. He says this peace treaty brings in its wake something which appears to be the first steps towards acquiring that puzzling truth drive, to wit, that which shall count as, quote, truth, from now on is established. That is to say, a uniformly valid and binding designation is invented for things, and this legislation of language likewise establishes the first laws of truth. But the contrast between truth and lies here arises for the first time. So basically, it's an agreement. We're going to say, hey, that's a tree, and we're like, okay, that's a tree, cool. It's not that it is a tree. It's that we're just agreeing to designate it as a tree. Now, and don't lose it here. Don't go off into some absurd direction with this. Clearly, there's something there, but that something there doesn't generate a name. It doesn't have a voice. It doesn't come pre-stamped as I am tree, call me tree, or I am mountain, call me mountain. I am this, call me this. That we come together and sort of slowly over time, a language evolves, and within this sort of linguistic, cultural, um, knowledge of symbols and things sort of referring to other things so that we can exist at peace with one another and that we can collaborate on sort of cultural or societal projects, we start calling things things. So that's a tree and that's a mountain and that's a desk and that's a computer, whatever. And so now we've set the conditions by coming to this peace treaty, this agreement, now we've set the conditions. So not only does this refer to knowledge, but now we can use this knowledge that we've invented by creating these labels and designations and all that stuff and their interrelations one to another. Now we have the conditions by which we can make a moral distinction, and that is one between a truth teller and a liar. And a truth teller is one who uses the words that we have used to designate this reality that we have created in the way that we've agreed to use those words. And then the liar is the one who doesn't. Here's the thing: we've always been lying. As that previous passage talks about, we've been deceiving each other, and we constantly deceive each other all the time. Like, we're always lying. So in a sense, truth telling now is lying in the agreed upon way. I'm going to lie, but in the way that, like, we all lie to each other, and so, like, it's cool. It goes unnoticed, right? But the liar now is the one who's lying in a way that we don't think is cool. We haven't agreed that way. So someone who has a lot of money is rich, and someone who doesn't have a lot of money is poor, right? But if the poor person claims to have a lot of money, we'll call them a liar, right? And if the rich person claims not to have a lot of money, right, then we'll call him a liar too. Hopefully that makes sense. Now, let's see. Let's go to page 116 and 117. Basically, here Nietzsche is going to talk about language a bit more, and his most basic claim is that words are metaphors. Like, we think of metaphors as like specific, specific words or phrases that are not being used in a literal sense, but in a figurative sense to convey something else about, a phenomenon, event, or whatever, right? So we deploy metaphors to bring out something that a literal usage of language, doesn't. But Nietzsche is saying it's all metaphor, because none of this stuff is like essential qualities. Like, these words are basically arbitrary. And if they weren't, right, then why do we have so many different languages? Like, if language actually connected to the phenomenon that it describes, why isn't there just one language? Why isn't there a universal language, right? Why are there so many different words for the same thing, right? That while we certainly as a species seem to have a language capacity, it doesn't have any, the language itself and the capacity itself doesn't actually, it's not congruent. It doesn't directly in a binding way correspond to all the phenomena that we're surrounded by. These are just labels that we put on things, and that's why you can have all these different languages with different designations, and somehow they're still able to negotiate reality and get things done and associate and collaborate and accord themselves with this peace treaty of truth and language. But his point, the takeaway here of these next couple of paragraphs, is that language is a metaphor, right? So that words are metaphors, language is essentially metaphoric. It's conveying a meaning between objects and then us, the people who want to speak about these objects. So if you go, now we're going to look at the second way that he talks about truth on page 117, last couple of paragraphs. He says, what then is truth? He says, a movable host of metaphors, metonymies, and anthropomorphisms, in short, a sum of human relations which have been poetically and rhetorically intensified, transferred, and embellished, and which after long usage seem to a people to be fixed, canonical, and binding. Like, we come to the view because we've used we've made these particular claims about reality, or we use these particular words, that we forget that that a person a long time ago, or that a people, a culture, whatever, that they invented these things, they created these things, and now they seem to us to be like fixed ideas that are just true, right? We forget their origins. What are they really? He says, truths are illusions, which we have forgotten are illusions. They are metaphors that have become worn out and have been drained of sensuous force. like coins, which have lost their embossing and are now considered as metal and no longer as coins. Yeah. So we've got truth as a peace treaty, and now truth as a metaphor, an illusion that we've forgotten is an illusion. Now you might be thinking, all right, well, what's the point of this? I mean, Nietzsche is for the creation of truth, but in a way in which we know that it's the creation of truth and not the discovery of some truth that was just there waiting for us to discover it. All right. So let's look at just a couple more things real quick. Let's go to the end of the work. Nietzsche is going to basically is going to talk about two different types of people, and by these types of people, this isn't like society at large. These are like two types of people that influence a culture. They are represented perhaps by many different professions or vocations, which sort of operate within a society or serve a society, and they are playing into, I think, two different forces that he talks about in his early work, The Birth of Tragedy, and that is like a Dionysian force and an Apollonian force. And these are, of course, references to those gods of the ancient Greeks. The Apollonian force, Apollo, this is a sort of force within society towards a type of order or organization of society in a way that tends to have the sort of rational quality, right? And that may not actually be accurate in terms of describing Apollo, and I think that the way that he talks about it in The Birth of Tragedy is much more nuanced and robust. However, just to sort of, simplify it a little bit, the Apollonian is the ordered, the structured, the rational. The Dionysian is, it's the non-rational. It is the appetitive. It is the creative. It's intoxicating. And these, so, I mean, they are both associated with various arts or even sciences, but to use a more common distinction would be something like the Apollonian would be science in the sense that we tend to talk about it now, and the Dionysian would correspond to the way that we would think about the arts. It's intuition. It's not trying to be particularly logical, or it has its own sort of rules for logic, and that these two forces are like in opposition. The intuitive forces that sort of can come through certain people who are in touch with their intuitions. They have this sort of creative genius about them, and then the people that are dealing more with like concepts and dealing more with a sort of rigid type of logic and rational organization. And that whichever of these two forces is dominant colors the society. It tells us what we privilege in our society. I mean, is everybody here at the university painting and drawing majors, or theater majors, creative writing? What that's I mean, it's a crazy question, I know, but look at what constitutes good argument in our society, what constitutes viable professions. What do we point to say that this is something that we trust and we can verify it? I mean, we like statistics, and it's more complicated than this because we live in a strange society that deals with misinformation, and people don't even know like what to do with the news or how to report the news, much less read the news. And we could probably spend a lot of time talking about that, and I hope someone is spending a lot of time talking about that. However, that there should be a balance of these two forces in society to have a healthy society. But what Nietzsche is going to argue is that there has been a predominance of the Apollonian in Western society for so long. Like the Enlightenment and sort of post-Enlightenment movements and what's been going on in science and in philosophy and in the other sort of areas of society, that the Dionysian has has been absent, or it's been diminished. And so what really kind of needs to happen is the Dionysian, the in tune with our instincts, like not being so overly rational, creative, that this needs to sort of have this resurgence and sort of reset the balance, or correct the imbalance, I'll say, so that we can perhaps in time return to some sort of balance and experience whatever our version of a healthy culture would be, like the Greeks. Again, not that we would look like Greek society, but if there was a time that the Greeks were the sort of apex of what a civilization could possibly be, and Nietzsche believes that that's the case, that it would take us restoring some sort of balance between recognizing that there are competing sorts of truths that these two forces, these two types of people generate. And it doesn't do us a lot of good to live in a society that puts forward scientific knowledge or scientific truths without a poetic version, a mythic version of truth as well, so that even the very idea of truth has some sort of actual significance or value to us and doesn't become cold and conceptual. He talks about this on page 121. He talks about the graveyard of perceptions and the prison of concepts. He talks about scientifically disenchanted thinkers, that these are just ways of describing a world in which there's, talking about the Dionysian, but I'll put it this way, a world in which like poetry doesn't mean anything, in which literature doesn't mean anything, in which if we don't know what to do with that stuff, it's a good indication of a certain intellectual or spiritual impoverishment, so that all we're left with is just cold organization, a cold order of knowledge that isn't going to help us confront the nihilistic destiny of a society that basically has no feeling for living, that has no way of being honest with itself about its motivations and limitations, and that this is a story that its ending can be and should be written by us knowing how it ends. And that, obviously we've talked a bit about how that is. Let's see. Yeah, what he says, and I want to just read this last part because it plays into one of the aphorisms we're reading for the next video. And this is near the end. It's on page 122. It's the paragraph that begins, "There are ages in which the rational man," right, that's the Apollonian, "and the intuitive man," that's the Dionysian, "stand side by side, the one in fear of intuition, the other in scorn of abstraction. The latter is just as irrational as the former is artistic. They both desire to rule over life." Drop down a couple lines. He says, "Whoever or whenever, as was perhaps the case in ancient Greece, the intuitive man handles his weapons more authoritatively and victoriously than his opponent, then, under favorable circumstances, a culture can take shape and art's mastery over life can be established." And this is like what he's advocating for, that the Dionysian, the artistic, the creative, the intuitive, can sort of reassert its mastery over life, in a culture. Again, not that everybody will do this. It's still just going to be a select few, but that people see that and they value that. And I don't think that it stays this way. The idea, again, would be this would act as a sort of course corrective so that things could like balance back out. So with that, we'll go ahead and stop here, and then I'll come back with a video covering the selection of aphorisms that I've asked you to read. So until then, keep reading, keep thinking, and I'll see you soon.